All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Kronos Group Podcast. I am your host, Jerry Brazie. I have a great guest today. Today it is Kevin Rice, and Kevin is the former agency founder who built it from the ground up. He started as a freelancer, scaled it up to $43 million in revenue, and then he got a nice acquisition on that. What he does now, I think, is probably just as important as what he built. He works with founders and CEOs who are scaling or are post-exit and want to lead better lives without burning themselves out, something we talk about a lot here on the podcast. He helps leaders move from operator mode to leadership mode, helping build healthy cultures, create accountability without fear, and scale with intention instead of just out there and hustling. And while building the company, obviously, everyone who follows this podcast knows how important this is to me. Kevin was also raising two sons as a single father, which shaped how he thinks about leadership. So I look forward to talking to him about that. He's also the host of the CEOs and ABCs podcast. So go check that out, where leaders have honest conversations about leadership in business and a presence in life. Kevin, I am happy that you are here, my friend. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm doing great, and I appreciate that fantastic introduction.
Sure. Let's start with the most basic of all podcast questions before we get into this. Give us a little 5-minute background on where you come from, where were you raised, kind of your pre-business life.
Yeah, sure. I grew up outside of Sacramento in the foothills, kind of on the way to South Lake Tahoe. I moved to San Luis Obispo when I turned 18 and kind of never looked back. I came here to go to Cal Poly. I studied business, I got my degree, and I decided that this is really the place that I wanted to, sink my roots. So I've been here ever since. I went to Cal Poly, graduated, and after I graduated from Cal Poly, I didn't want to go out and just get a traditional corporate job. I wanted to try to do something on my own. I had not much to lose at the time, so it makes it really easy to take risks. And my best friend from college, who I met it was literally day one of being in the dorms, and I started a company together. And it really just started as us kind of freelancing some websites, doing small business work. But over time, it started to grow into much more enterprise type engagements. And we started seeing the semblance of an organization that we could grow and scale. And ultimately, that's what we did. We grew it to 250 employees. We had a 9-figure exit. And, that was kind of what I thought at the time was going to be the pinnacle of my career. It wasn't necessarily. It was just kind of like one peak that I had reached. And I realized afterwards there was still a long way to go.
So many people think that would be the pinnacle of somebody's career. And so it's interesting that you realized that afterwards. Was that because money was no longer an issue for you and you could go do what you really wanted to go do? Or was there something else that you found that maybe you weren't able to see when you were inside of the business?
Yeah, I think more of the latter. It was just really, coming to a realization that I had poured my entire adult life into my career, and that didn't really leave much for myself or for my kids. And I after selling the company, I was expecting to feel like I was on top of a mountain, like all the joy, the celebration, and it just didn't really feel that way. It felt like another Monday. Like the business was no longer ours that we had spent 13 years building. Now I was an employee of another company. Yes, there was financial freedom that came with it, but it didn't land. I didn't feel that relief. I didn't feel that joy and celebration that I thought I was going to feel. And I kind of had to figure out what was going on to understand why I experienced it that way. And so I took some time doing a lot of internal work. And this is kind of where I say, like, it was a false peak because the real work happened after we sold the company. And that was all inner work that I needed to do because I'd spent 2 years in just so much stress and pressure. Our company was growing. We were adding 50 to 100 people every year. And there was just so much pressure to perform. The only way that I could cope with that performance pressure was to really just shove down all of my emotions and kind of go into this, what I would call robot mode, where I was performing at a very high level. I could work 12, 14-hour days and still be efficient towards the end of the day. And I was still taking care of my kids at the time. I was a single parent. raising a 3.5-year-old and a 2-month-old by myself. But in order to like take care of all my responsibilities, I really just had to disconnect from myself. And so the problem is when you disconnect from yourself, you're disconnected from others. So my colleagues, my children. And when you have these moments that should feel like a high, you don't really feel much of anything at all because you've done so much like work to disconnect from the good and the bad.
Yeah, I get the high part. I've said many times that the problem with getting money is once you can afford something, you want something else. And then pretty soon the things that you can just go buy whenever you want aren't nearly as valuable. When I was paying half of the electric bill in my early 20s, and Taco Bell would sell 29 cent, or was it 39 cent and 49 cent soft tacos and hard tacos. And that was a meal out for me. And anything over and above that was an extravagance that I just couldn't even appreciate. So when it happened, it was a big deal. Well, then jump forward 10 years, I'm living in a completely different world, thousands and thousands of restaurant meals that I have eaten in since, including last night's, doesn't mean quite so much to me as it did all those years ago when I had nothing. So I look at it very differently then, with a fondness almost, with an emotional attachment, unlike the dinner that I ate last night. So I guess the question is, should those two things be the same? Should they feel the same? Or is there a level up that needs to come and you have to find that new kind of thing that brings you that emotion?
Well, first of all, before I answer the question, I did the same thing. Like after I sold my company, I bought a Porsche. I drove it maybe 5 times. 6 months later, sold it because I never used it. And for the first few days, I loved it. I loved driving the car. The excitement kind of waned pretty quickly. So, money buys a lot of freedom, but it certainly won't buy you guaranteed happiness.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, and I constantly am searching those things out as I need. For myself personally, I need things to go work towards. So I'm a big car guy. So in the early days, it was cars, but then it became my family when my children were born, and now my children are grown, and now I'm trying to figure out what that next thing is. Let's talk about though the work itself. If you could say one thing and snap your fingers and go back, you said it was 13 years that you did it. So let's go back to year 6. And you could say to yourself, okay, I've got 7 more years of doing this before I sell out. What's the one thing that you would have changed looking at it backwards now from all these years later?
Well, if I knew I had 7 more years of that much stress and pressure ahead of me, I don't know if I would have continued on. For me, it was always kind of like early on, somewhat of illusions of grandeur, thinking, okay, we're going to sell this in the next year. And then the next year became 2 years and 3 years. And it was just kind of slowly building. Like we weren't some internet startup that, became a unicorn overnight. This was slow building a services business. And we had no experience. So we had to just kind of figure it out as we went. I think what eventually really made a huge shift for us was we actually had to do a layoff. And that was really painful because we had to look people in the eye and tell them you no longer have a job, when at the time we were still very much like a family style culture at the company. But after that layoff, it brought to light a lot of things that we weren't doing right in the company that I'm glad we made then, but it would have been nice to make these changes earlier. The first is our revenue wasn't a sustainable business model. It was all project based. So it was like we do a big 7-figure project and then it would be over. And then we would have to figure out the next project for all the people that were working on that to like transition over to. So we had to shift from being project based to more long-term strategic partner so that we would sign 2-3-year contracts. Then we made a very big change that was deciding to focus on one industry. And that industry for us was the restaurant industry. Prior to that, we were working in healthcare. We were working in like B2B tech, CPG, retail. We were just all over the place. And that meant we couldn't be very profitable because we were constantly learning new things. So once we made the decision to focus on one industry that we were making a bet on, we saw this wave of transformation happen in retail, and we were making a bet that it would happen in restaurants. And so by making that decision, we actually shuttered clients that we had worked with for a handful of years, like significant revenue, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And we told these clients, we can no longer work with you. We'll help you find a new partner. but it just doesn't fit where we're going anymore. And that was a big risk that I think a lot of startup founders or executives aren't willing to take because it's a fear of losing revenue versus seeing the potential to have more profitable revenue. So, right, a bigger piece of a smaller pie. That was really important for us. And then the third thing we did was we invested in IP. We actually built like a technology accelerator that allowed us to do our work more efficiently and cost effectively. And so once we wrote code that was something only we had, only we could bring to the market, it gave us a true differentiator. Because in this whole consulting industry, a lot of people try to position maybe advantages as a differentiator, but they're not truly distinct, right? So you could say we have the best people, we have the best culture, we have the best processes, but everybody says that. It's until you have something that nobody else has that you can finally like lead your sales narrative towards that value proposition and really start winning deals at a higher rate. In the last 2 years of our business, we were at an 80% win rate because we knew how to steer the conversation to what we were best at. So those were probably the three things I wish I would have done earlier, but eventually they came up when kind of crisis, we were in the midst of a crisis.
And the restaurant pivot then ultimately turned out to be beneficial, it sounds like.
Absolutely. We started working with some of the earliest restaurant groups when they didn't have online ordering, digital loyalty programs, advanced CRM programs. So we launched Wingstop, who's a multi-billion-dollar brand. We launched their online ordering program and underlying like CRM platform in 2017. Today, they do billions of dollars through that platform. And so we ended up with about 50 of the top restaurant chains, Dutch Bros, Burger King, Panda Express, Red Robin, like the list goes on. And so we were really able to own this specific category. So when it came to a potential acquirer, we had 50 companies interested in acquiring us. And we were able to like narrow it down and find the company that we felt like had a strong cultural fit that we could just roll right up into.
And the new business with the restaurants, was it a more redundant revenue model?
So it was more consistent. Yeah. So it was like more reoccurring. We would sign at a minimum annual contracts. And so what we had to do there was we had to kind of shift their thinking from we need to build, say, a mobile application to we need to create a long-term digital strategy, and a mobile application is one piece of that. So our entire sales process was changing the way that they saw their needs, again, from a point solution to a strategic partner. And then we could create strategies, roadmaps, digital maturity models to show them where they're at today and where we're going to take them over the next 3 years. And if we could get buy-in on that 3 years, we could get a 3-year contract.
Having been down this road many, many times myself, both personally and working with other people, rarely does, in the long term, someone selling to someone larger turn out well in terms of the long-term employment opportunity for the previous owners. I think the stories are legend at all sizes of businesses where it didn't work out. So you went through your due diligence and you thought someone was going to buy you that was going to be good for the culture and you thought would be a good fit. How did that work out? Because that is a road many people have tried to go down, not very successfully.
This worked out great. But before I talk about the acquisition of Bounteous, we did actually try to sell at the end of 2019, and that one failed. And this is one of those moments where at the time, it was just really painful. We were about to sign a contract on December 3rd. And on the day we were supposed to sign the contract, all parties walked away. And so we were 24 hours from, deal closing, money in the bank, new company, corporate owner. When that fell apart, I was just kind of a little lost trying to figure out, okay, maybe this isn't going to happen. Maybe I need to rethink my future because my entire net worth was in this company that we had started. But looking back, it was the best thing that ever happened to us. We spent the next 2 years running a full process. We hired a banking firm that actually gave us a lot of leverage in the process and gave us a strategic partner to help guide us through the process. And when we eventually sold less than 12 months later, this was end of 2020. Yeah, end of 2020. And then so about 12 months later, we ended up increasing our revenue by 2 times. So going from 20 to 42 million and increasing our multiplier 2 times. So we had a much more substantial multiplier. We had more profit. Ultimately, our exit was 5 times more than we would have sold for just a year earlier. So these are those moments where you look back and
Wow.
at the time it was really painful, but you look back and you're like, thank God that happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And
then
the suitor, yeah.
Yeah. So then when we eventually got acquired by Bounteous, we had the luxury of having a team. I mean, anybody who's going through selling your company and running your company at the same time, it is 2 jobs. It is 2 full-time jobs that you are doing at the same time concurrently. And so we did 30 presentations. We narrowed it down. We eventually kind of got to our last few potential acquirers. We really aligned with this company, Bounteous. They provided all the same like solutions we provide, but they did it in other industries. So by acquiring Hathaway, we could essentially roll up and become a new business unit, and overnight be one of their largest business units. But we went with them just because they had an amazing culture, and every one of our team members moved over. Everybody had a role, and they had more upward mobility now because they were kind of maxing out and they could only grow at the same speed in which our company was growing. Well, now they had a whole organization to be a part of. So tons more opportunity for our team members. I will say there were some layoffs that came later, but it wasn't part of the plan when we were acquired. It was simply just due to some over forecasting and having too many people with not enough work.
Let's pivot a little bit. In this space, I hear more and more about people working in the business and on the business. And it seems to come from people who have gone through it and then look back and they have a different take on it. But I always say, I've never met an entrepreneur, particularly in the first few years of a startup, that isn't working in, on, around, up, on top of, below, and around their business, right? They're involved 100% year over year. And I think business by itself as an entrepreneur is a hard enough undertaking. The failure rates are gigantic. And so there seems to be a culture in social media in particular that encourages people or lets them know that, if you're not working 4 hours, if you're working more than 4 hours a week and driving a Lamborghini, you're doing something wrong, those sorts of things. And so give me your take from that perspective about the entrepreneur, in particular, the early stage guy working in the business and on the business. And I don't know how to decouple those things myself in those early days because it takes so much dedication to get something off the ground. I'd love to hear your take on that.
Building a business is incredibly hard. It's a lot of work, whether you're an executive at a Fortune 500 company and you're leading business units or you're starting your own company. It's not a 9 to 5 job. And so I've had this conversation with a lot of people. I don't think that work-life balance in the idea of measured by time, meaning like I spend 8 hours on work, 8 hours in family, 8 hours sleeping, I don't think that's realistic. What I see a lot of earlier stage entrepreneurs missing is that element of working on the business. So they're so involved in the business, doing the day-to-day work, that they're not able to develop strategies and think more broadly about where the business is going to go. I always loved working on the business. So, and I worked a lot. So I would put in a full day work. And then in the cracks, I was always thinking about, okay, how do we make the business structure, processes, systems more scalable? And that was something we did really well early on. Was even when there was work that my co-founder and I, Jesse, could do ourselves, we knew that we had to hire other people to do that work so that we could leverage our time and scale up. And I actually learned this lesson in college. I ran a residential house painting business. It was my first foray into running a small business. And in my second summer season doing it, I had 5 crews, did about 150,000 in revenue. I managed the profit on that and I was able to keep the profit. But what I learned was I don't pick up paintbrushes, not because it's beneath me, but because if I pick up paintbrushes, then I'm not out knocking on doors. I'm not doing estimates. I'm not closing new deals. I'm not reviewing the finances. So it's always important to take things off your plate, even if you can do it yourself and it risks dropping your margin a little bit, because that's how you scale.
And this is, I think the answer comes back is the same every time. So I'm happy to hear you say that. It's not that you are painting the house, but you do know how to paint the house, right?
I mean, I was never like trained as a house painter, but
Sure.
I knew enough to, it's a pretty simple thing to do.
Right. If somebody didn't show up, you're not above grabbing the paintbrush and going to town. You knew the
No,
process. You knew where the equipment came from. You know how to operate it. You know how to make the thing
absolutely,
function if somebody didn't show up.
for sure.
Yeah, and I think that is the important message, which is for anybody. And I agree with you. My story, that what dawned on me, I'm a poor kid from the streets. I didn't know anything, and when I came in, my businesses were doing millions of dollars a year, tens of millions of dollars a year. And my assistant came to me, and I was paying my bills at home, on my home bills, and this is 25 years ago. And she said, "What in the hell are you doing?" And I said, "I'm paying my bills." And she said, "No, no, no, no." And this is how I learned this. This is after, and I had big thriving businesses. And she said, "No, no, you need to be thinking about the business, not thinking about paying your bills. Give me all that." And, I never paid another bill in my life after that. She took it all over and did it. And it dawned on me right there exactly what you're saying is, I'm not above paying my bills, but I know how to pay my bills, or I know how to pay my bills, and I'm not above doing that, but my time is better spent doing something else. But that doesn't mean that I don't know how to do the work. There's this misnomer in social media and in culture today around business that if you're working in your business, i.e., if you know how to do the work that needs to be done and you understand it at a granular level, that you're doing something wrong.
Yeah, I don't agree with that. I think there are going to be times where you have to have team members doing work that's outside of your skill set, and you need to learn to
Sure.
manage that too. It was a lot easier for us to bring in contractors and eventually employees that were doing the work that we did know how to do because we could manage it. We knew what good looked like. But over time, once we started getting into more complex types of like enterprise systems implementations, like, there was a lot of stuff that I'm not going to get in the code and review it, but I knew how to manage, like understand process, phase
Yeah.
gates, critical paths, dependencies, and know like, okay, are we on track or not? And then hire team members that could manage all of those factors. And so, yeah, it's like you are, as the organization scales, you're focusing on what only you can do. And anything that somebody else could do, you're taking it off your plate. So you're just doing the things that you are best at. That's your highest leverage time.
Yeah. A good example of that for me is IT, and probably for anybody. I understand IT. I understand what can be done with it. If I don't understand, I go ask questions. I'm inquisitive, but I'm not writing code. I don't have any concept of how that works. I'd have trouble wiring a desktop. But I understand what that desktop can do. I understand how important it is. And then I'm also very inquisitive about how can we push the boundaries of what this piece of equipment or what this code or what this process can do for us. And I think that's the important part. It's not just outselling, it's understanding how your business works. With that said, then term, again, you came back to this on the 8 hours, 8 hours, and 8 hours, this work-life balance theme that we continue to hear. I'm a believer that 85% of what I see on the internet relative to business and entrepreneurship and even careers is not correct. It's not the advice that I would give. It's not been my lived experience having operated all of these businesses over the years. It's very, very different. And so I come at it with the approach that this idea, again, I always go to the extreme, if you're working more than 4 hours a week, and if you're not driving a Lamborghini, you're doing something incorrect, which is kind of the caricature, of the internet. That work-life balance is found somewhere else, in particular for an entrepreneur. So let's go back to what you said about the 888 and give us an idea of how you dealt with that and maybe what you would have done differently.
Yeah, I mean, finding a business model that can earn you 7+ figures a year while only working 4 hours a week feels like lightning in a bottle to me, right? It does happen. Right. And that's amazing for the people it happens to. That wasn't my experience. Maybe I'm just not that smart, but I worked really, really hard. And that was my path towards, success in my career.
To be clear, I've known 1,000 entrepreneurs. I know hundreds of millionaires, and not a single one of them ever started a business that they didn't work their ass off. I mean, literally for years in the trenches to get the thing up and running. So I'm not aware of anyone that ever does it, but I understand that it has happened at some point.
Yeah. Would have been nice, but not my
right.
experience. That said, so back to your question about work-life balance, somebody recently asked me like, "Hey, would you have done anything different?" And I think it's yes and no. No, I wouldn't have not worked as hard as I did. That got me to where I am, and it helped me learn and grow throughout every stage of the process. I don't think I would be where I am today. I don't think our company would have been if both me and my business partner, Jesse, didn't work as hard as we did. I would do some things differently. And this is kind of what brings me to today and my perspective on being more intentional and present with my family. Because there were years where I was home with the kids. I was making their meals. I was getting them ready for the day. We were doing bedtime routines. So I was physically there, like checking a box, but I wasn't emotionally or mentally mental for those moments. Like I could read a bedtime story and be thinking about a sales presentation, or I could be thinking about something that needs to be done in our next leadership meeting. That's not presence. Like kids feel your energy. So
Mm-hmm.
what I would have done was in those moments that I was with my kids, I would have given them my real presence and I would have been more intentional with that time. Like planning how we're going to spend our weekend together instead of just finishing a work week, being totally depleted and just kind of rolling through the weekend and seeing what comes. Today I'm much more intentional about like I plan my personal life with the same amount of detail that I plan my professional life.
Yeah, I think I've always said that it is quality over quantity, and the world has it wrong. And they do that backwards, and they do quantity over quality. And the quantity is a couple hours with the kids, maybe, or you're going to the game, or you're doing the coaching, and then you're at home on the couch watching the game. The kids go to bed, and you're sitting at home watching on the couch for another couple of hours. And for me, my children will say that I was there about 80% of the time to put them to bed. So I would drop what I was doing wherever I was, as long as I was in town, and I would go home and we would wrestle and fight, and I wouldn't answer a phone. They got all of my time, and then I would put them to bed, and we had this little thing that we did every night because I wanted to make sure they remembered it, where I would ask them, "What are you going to be when you grow up?" And they'd say, "Whatever I want." And I'd say, "How are you going to get there?" And they'd say, "I'm going to work hard and I'm going to be smart." And I was like, "Fantastic." And, then I'd go into the next kid's room and the next kid's room. And we did that about 80% of the time. And then I went back to work because I was working, again, 15, 16-hour days. But the reality was that they remember those wrestling and those times fondly now. They all live in and around me. I see them almost every single day. My one son is in the military. So I was able to do that by making sure that my time was quantity time was quality time and not just quantity time. And if that meant I shut off the phone and I lost a sale, it just meant I shut off the phone and I lost a sale. But, if we were going to the movies and going to go to Chuck E. Cheese, on a Saturday afternoon, they're getting my movies and my Chuck E. Cheese time. And I was able to just, pull out 3 or 4 hours, but it wasn't 3 or 4 hours every single day, like clockwork, home when they got, or I was home when they got home, and I was there when they went to bed and when they got up in the morning. That wasn't the reality. And it seemed to have worked out just fine. And so this idea, I think, is what I'm against, that it takes that 8 hours at home with your kids, because I don't think anybody ever does that.
Yeah, I think that's amazing that you were able to do that. I think a lot of executives struggle with being mentally present when they walk through the door at home because there is just a lot of stress and there's a lot of pressure, and the work, can always, it's always available to you, like in your pocket. Slack messages, emails. What you did that was really special for your children was you have rituals, right? Asking them the same questions in bed. Those rituals start to become identity for them. And those are really foundational depending on the ages of the children. But they're going to carry that with them. It's going to be like a core memory, but it's also going to be a part of their identity as they become adults.
Yeah, I think that it was since they were little. They're now 28, 26, and 24. They're just doing fantastically. And again, most importantly, I've been married now. We've been together. We've been married coming up on 29 years, been together 32 years. So, mom and dad are still together, and that's helpful without a doubt. But regardless, they remember those wrestling times all these years later with a fondness, and I have a great relationship with them while I was doing all of this building. This is really why I push back against it. And I like to talk to other entrepreneurs who have been through this, because there is just this massive misnomer. I'll say it again for the second or third time on the podcast, that you can't have a work life and a home life in any kind of balance. And again, I am proof that that's not the case. You sound like you're proof that that's not the case. Is it what, I don't know, the magazines would tell you it's supposed to look like? Is it what the psychiatrists would tell you it's supposed to look like? No. Is it what popular culture tells you it should look like? No. But I don't know. I put my record up against anybody.
Yeah, and let's look at the positive side of it too, because children that see you working hard for something you're passionate about, that instills something in them. And I
Mhm.
actually, so after my company was acquired, I spent a year kind of doing the transition process, and I fully planned on staying at the company, but I realized I needed to take some time off to kind of do my own internal work and rebuilding process. And that gave me more time to like work on myself, be present for my kids, and really rethink how I wanted to like show up for them.
How old were they when this took place? What kind of time frame were we talking about? What age?
So at this point, they would have been like 2 and 5 ish, two
Uh-huh.
and five and a half, something like
Right.
that. So I spent 2 years on a sabbatical. That's a long time, but I had a lot to fix.
Mhm.
And I had this thought of, I learned my work ethic from my father. I saw him work really hard in his career. He's a civil engineer, and he was very successful. I took that and it was instilled in me, and I didn't know any other way. So when it came to starting my own company, like I was able to work hard. So I was starting to have concerns that if my kids didn't see me doing the same thing, what is that going to teach them when they grow up? Like one of my biggest fears is just having entitled children that think the world is going to give them whatever they want. And so part of the reason I went back into my career was because I wanted them to see what it looks like to pursue something you're passionate about. So I started doing angel investing. I do a little bit of consulting, but my real passion is the podcast that I created, CEOs and ABCs, because that is a message that I feel like is really important and underserved within like the corporate professional community.
I come from a very different background. Like I said, dirt poor, no schooling, no education, every job in the world. And when I was 28, I started my first company. And I started my first company because I had a son at 28, my first son, and it changed my life. The 1 second my wife is pregnant, people who listen to this podcast have heard this story a million times. 1 second she's pregnant, and I'm this person. The next second she was no longer pregnant, and I'm not the same person anymore. And it changed my world. And I felt like I needed to go out and split atoms. Right. All of a sudden, I was like, I'm child number 7 of 9, and I grew up in abject poverty. My children were not going to have this life. They were not going to have the life that my older brothers and sisters were giving to their kids, and jail and pregnancy and all of those things that come out of kind of that, poor white trash. And I wasn't going to do that. And I was driven at a level. I mean, I was already driven. I was running a company for somebody else. I'd already gone far beyond anything I should have ever been able to accomplish at that point. But I mean, it took it like it wasn't even in place, and it brought a ferocity to my determination, to my risk taking, to my sacrifice, to my shutting up and listening and taking advice from other people in a way that was very difficult for me to do, particularly where I come in. I'm 17 years old living with hookers and heroin addicts in a $25 a week flop house, but I still was holding down a full-time job because I knew how to work. And so when my son was born, and then my daughter followed 2 years later, and my second son followed 2 years after that. I mean, man, I woke up every morning wanting to go hit a dinosaur over the head and drag it back to the cave so the kids could eat. And it, to this day, continues to drive me. Yes, setting an example, but also to make sure that I give my family a life that I never had. And it really, that kind of caveman go out and forage and risk and sacrifice and feel better for it because you are benefiting your children. It lit a fire in me like that is, I can't even do my best to try to describe it, but is undescribable. So in that context of you taking the time off, particularly when they're so young, I would give up my fortune right now if somebody said, you can go back and your kids be 2, 4, and 6. And I have a fantastic relationship with my kids. I love them to death. I see them all the time. But there's just nothing more valuable than 2, 4, and 6. But when they're 2, 4, and 6, it's almost, there's no appreciation for that. If I had to work double shifts at Taco Bell, it would be such a cheap price to have to pay to have my kids be that young again. And in that context, though, I don't know that I would change much that I did, having said that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like time is the only currency we really have. And when you have children, for me, work was my passion, but my children were my purpose, right? Everything I
Yeah.
was doing was to give them more opportunities, a better life. But in turn, because I was giving 100% of my energy to my career, there just really wasn't much left for my kids. The way that started to materialize was because they didn't have a primary parental connection with their mom, who was no longer in their life, and me, who was working, traveling, building this company. They started acting out in different ways, like might be labeled as like defiance, might be like labeled as ADHD. But what I learned, and I know to be true, was it's a result of not having a primary parental attachment figure for the first few years. And I'm on a podcast, buddy. My son walked in. They're
No worries.
homeschooled.
Yep.
I'll be
Fantastic.
out in a
No
few
worries.
minutes. Okay. I'm on a podcast. I told you we need to edit something.
It's no worries. I'm leaving it in. I love it.
So when children don't have a primary parental attachment figure, they don't learn how to co-regulate their nervous system, because like learning to regulate your nervous system is not something a child learns on their own. That's why self-soothing isn't an effective approach to getting kids to like go to sleep on their own. They don't learn to regulate their nervous system. And so their frustration tolerance was really low. They go to 0 to 10 really fast. And I've seen, maybe it was like Gabriel Mate talk about how like if you don't do it right in the first 3 years, you're going to spend the next 15 years remedially parenting the way you should have done it. And that's kind of what I've been doing for the past 4 years. Is sometimes my kids will sleep in bed with me. We get quality time together. Like if they're frustrated, I sit on the floor, we breathe together, we count, we do tapping. Like I'm going back through the process of teaching them how to regulate their nervous system, because I wasn't fully present and available to do it when they were in those earliest couple years of their lives.
Yeah, I think that's important to hear, in particular in those early years. So, to anybody, I love the story, and I love that they walked in. That's exactly what I want to see, and we need more of that. So, I'm leaving that in the podcast. That's fantastic. Let's go back to the business a little bit. In that growth, when you're doing all of that, you're trying to scale. A lot of things that the people have issues with is bringing the people along with you, right? When you're growing like that. And so, how'd you do it? How'd you do it without putting massive pressure on them or scaring the hell out of them or, asking them to do heroic things? Maybe you did. How'd you do it when you scale? Because, I think anybody that has grown like what you guys did, that is a daunting task for sure.
It was a lot of just making sure the wheels weren't going to fly off the bus. And it was making sure people were continually pointed in the right direction. So I started studying change management probably in 2018. And as we were starting to get to like 100 employees, I didn't know every employee anymore. I didn't know their families. And that's just kind of the stage of the business you get to. And so you need to figure out how to manage change more broadly across an organization and keep people moving in the direction. Because at that size, we would have different like factions kind of come together. And at one point, there was a growing movement to shutter our consulting business and start a SaaS company. And we had a viable business that was growing. It was difficult, really difficult, but everybody saw these other SaaS companies growing at 10 times faster than we were growing. And so there was like this shiny object, and everybody's rallying like we need to embrace pivot culture and we need to change. But we had a viable company that was growing and working. And so it was just keeping everybody aligned and staying the course so that we could eventually keep growing and get to where we wanted to be. So change management was really important. I would say the other thing that was always very helpful was we embraced coaches, business coaches, very early in our career. Within the first couple of years, we worked with like a business coach that really taught us the basics, just like the ones of running a company, leadership meetings, one-on-ones, daily or like weekly tracking and metrics, the simplest stuff. And then we moved on to somebody who was more of an industry expert who could teach us the kind of ins and outs of our industry. And then lastly, over the last like 3 years of the company, we worked with somebody who was kind of more like a Tony Robbins style, like motivational coach. And that was really important as we were putting so much stress on the system to give our entire leadership team somebody to work with to kind of like work through the struggles that come with that sort of growth.
And so the motivational thing was it one-on-one? Was it group? You know, it's I always struggled being able to motivate the group from a speech because or from a speaker simply because he couldn't boil down to what the issue that person or that, you know, specific small group in the company might have had vis-a-vis all of the other ones.
Yeah, we paid for a pretty substantial engagement with him. So I would say he's like a performance coach, right? And we hired him to work with me and my co-founder, but he also worked with our executive leadership team. So there was about 10 people that he worked with on a like every other week basis. So he'd work with our C-suite and then he'd work with our whole like VP suite of team as well. And so he could also help us kind of understand what was going on within the broader teams and help us kind of see gaps that maybe we weren't seeing.
And then they would communicate that back up to you, whatever issues they had, and there was that pipeline so that problems could be dealt with, and
Yeah, it was always
issues
direct
that might not have been
communication.
raised with
Yeah.
you would be raised with him, that sort of thing? Or was there a therapy perspective to it, you know, i.e. secretive?
I mean, there's always a little bit of, you know, protecting somebody's privacy, but usually it starts with an expectation of, hey, anything we talk about, if I need to, I will communicate more broadly, right? So there's like setting that expectation that it's not meant to be therapy, it's not meant to be private conversations. It's meant to
Mhm.
understand what challenges you're facing within your part of the organization and then allow that to circulate to people that needed to hear it. And like I said, this just helped us see blind spots that maybe we otherwise wouldn't have seen.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's helpful for sure. CEOs and ABCs. Let's talk about that. That seems to be your front facing, public facing work that you're doing now in your attempts to try and help founders realize how they need to go find more help so that they can scale and maybe get themselves a little bit more time. But let's talk about the podcast a little bit and what you're doing with that.
Yeah. So it started middle of last year, so still relatively new to this. But I was at a conference and two things happened. Very random, but it's kind of how the universe works to like plant seeds in your mind. Was I was watching Halle Berry on stage talking about how she had this and she had this incredible career, completely changed the face of Hollywood for black actresses. And she's in this kind of next chapter of her career. She called it her Act Two, in which she started a women's longevity company. And it got me thinking, like, what's my Act Two? Right. I know that I need to get back into something. I want to show my kids the value of working hard for something you're passionate about, but I didn't know what it was going to be. I enjoy doing consulting, but it's not like something I'm deeply passionate about anymore because I've kind of done that for a long time. So then I was I was sitting down with a somebody who I had just met, and we, you know, at conferences they have different like little exhibits and booths and stuff, and this was a tarot reading. So we sat down, and the guy next to me asked the question of, how do I continue to grow my career but not sacrifice my family? And that was something I had been thinking about a lot lately. And so at that conference, I started to crystallize an idea around creating a forum that we can talk about how hard it really is to be an executive and still be present and intentional and show up for your family in the same way you show up for your career. And so that's where it kind of originated. And we've done 25 episodes or so over the last 6 months. And it's just been a really like meaningful passion project for me.
And the when you're talking about those executives, what is the hardest thing that you find that they can't give up, or you have to convince them? If you had to pick one thing, you come in, the guy's overwhelmed, he's doing too much, he thinks he's the stopgap for everything. Everything is going through him. What's the one thing that you've noticed in your time then that somebody could take and say, "Oh, I'm doing that thing. I heard that podcast with Kevin Rice. I need to look at that."
Well, I've continually heard about trusting and leading through your team, right? In most organizations, it's a leverage scale model. right? So you have team members that allow you to do your job more robustly because you have multiple people working on it, right? So it's
Mhm.
understanding how to delegate, but not necessarily abdicate. And as you delegate properly and you manage through your team members, you're getting more and more work done as it goes further and further down the levels. And so a lot of people on my show have just talked about the importance of setting expectations, training, coaching, and then trusting that your team is going to be able to execute. Like if you can't take a week vacation and have things run pretty smoothly, there's a problem with how you're leading your team. And so I think to answer your question directly, it's making sure that you have enough delegated off your plate so that you don't have to be in every single decision. And that allows you to free up some time so that, it's not 10 o'clock at night and you're filling all the gaps that you could have had other team members fill for you.
Yeah, I think that's something that everybody can learn. And I always say I can come in as a consultant on almost any business, and I'm going to find you 4 or 5 points of margin. And anybody walks into any of my businesses is probably going to be able to find 5 points of margin because you're in the business, and so you think the way that you're doing it, it can't be done any other way. And the analogy is you're in the hole, and you can't see out of it, and somebody comes in and they can see it from the outside and they have a better perspective than you do. So I think that's important for people to hear that perspective, because I can hear myself, particularly as a younger man, and so many other people pushing back on that and saying, no, Kevin doesn't understand. If I'm not here making these decisions, the company's not here, and there's no one else can do it because they don't care as much. They don't have the financial interest as much. They go home at 5 o'clock and the work's not going to get done. The phone won't get answered. And to some extent, in particular for the early years, I suppose that has some validity to it. I have a customer that has spent $30 million with me over the last 25 years because I answered the phone 25 years ago on a Saturday afternoon when she called two other companies and they didn't answer. And she had a personal problem, not even a business problem. And I answered the phone because I was just rabid like that. And again, this customer's spent $1 million a year with me ever since. So I guess there's some validity to that. But at the same time, it's hard to hear that from the outside when you're burning it on the inside trying to make that thing go, and you have all of the risk associated with the vagaries of the business and whether or not it does well.
Yeah, it sounds like somewhat of a people problem, right? Not being able to delegate responsibly and appropriately and then not abdicate. But it's also a business problem. A lot of times you need to like up level what you're looking at to understand really what's making things difficult. And so if your business is structured in a way that you're the only one that can provide service or operate it, then maybe there's a problem with the complexity of the business.
Mm-hmm.
Complexity is going to be an enemy of scale. And so the more you simplify, what we found when we went all in on the restaurant category was our margins went up because we didn't have to learn as much as we went from client to client. Our team members were more fungible because the engagements were more similar. Again, we could take one person who was doing a online ordering experience for one client, and if they had 8 hours to wait while there was a review cycle happening, they could go support on another client. That's not fungible if your business is so complex that every client needs are very different from each other. So sometimes it might just be the business is too complicated to scale, and that requires you as the owner to be in every facet of it because nobody else can succeed in that sort of like dynamic.
Yeah, that's a good point. The more individual the work, the more time it takes to manage it, the more the margin gets eroded.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. Couple of questions here as we go out. A little speed round. So just good, bad, right or wrong or indifferent. Give me right off the top of your head just a couple of words how you would answer these couple of questions. The first one is, what is the most overrated metric during rapid growth?
Just all the vanity metrics, right?
Yeah.
Impressions, clicks, things like that. I mean, you need to be focused on EBITDA.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. Imagine that. Pay attention to cash, money, how the company's doing, the important things. One early sign a culture is breaking from that growth.
Clicks, factions forming, rumors spreading, things like that.
Yeah. Interesting. How do you fight that?
By bringing people together, and like I mentioned earlier, having a really strong like change management program so that everybody feels like they're working towards the same outcome and they believe in where the company is going. So mission, vision, values, core values are really important to how you operate and manage a business and how you make decisions for the company, and then creating alignment within those values.
Communication, obviously, very important. A mistake founders repeat once it starts going up. What is something a founder does repeatedly that you see?
Realizing that their business model does need to change, right? What got you there isn't what's going to get you to the next level. So you might need to drop your, gross margin in order to get to the next level.
Right, right. Last question. What have kids taught you about leadership that or just life in general? We'll say leadership, but even life in general that no MBA ever did.
I think the biggest lesson is that they are my greatest mirror, and any change that I want to see in them needs to start with me.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. Kevin, fantastic conversation. Let's tell folks again, tell them about your podcast and how to get a hold of you.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, the podcast is CEOs and ABCs. There's a website, ceosandabcs.com. We post all of the episodes. All the episodes are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. And I'm probably most active on LinkedIn. So, if you have any thoughts or questions, feel free to drop me a message.
And if you didn't get that, we, of course, will put that in the show notes so that you can get a hold of Kevin. If what he said and he is doing, if that resonates with you and you're an entrepreneur out there and you think you need another perspective, clearly my man here knows what he's talking about. Kevin, I appreciate you coming on. Thanks very much.